Hello, I am Victoria Johanovic, currently a student at American University in the Healthcare Management program. Today I will be discussing the Shell oil spill crisis in the Niger Delta, and we will discuss the intercultural communication barriers that resulted in this crisis. It is important that we discuss the history of oil spills in the Niger Delta. There's an apparent history of oil spills in the Delta, as mentioned on the slide. These spills have resulted in extreme and drastic effects. These effects impacted the lives of 80% of the people who were fishermen and farmers, who now can no longer rely on the Delta as a source for job and revenue. It is important to mention that throughout the history of these spills, Shell has claimed that the majority of these spills were caused by vandalism, theft, and sabotage by Nigerian people. It is also important to mention that if third-party interference is involved in proven, compensation is denied to the people of the land. However, protocol for cleanup is still followed. The Nigerian government and the people deny that the majority of the spills were caused by third-party interference. However, in 2013, an out-of-court settlement was reached and Shell delegated $53 million to the 15,000 fishermen and farmers. But long-term effects will forever have a negative impact on the land and people. The multiple spills over the decades estimated at 17.5 million liters spilt into the Delta, and the UNP estimates 30 years to clean up the oil. As well, it is vital to the discussion to understand the complex relationship between the Nigerian government and the British Dutch-owned oil company Shell. Prior to analyzing the intercultural barriers that led to the improper communication, Shell has had a steady presence in the Delta and remains one of the largest infrastructures. As well, Shell's presence in Nigeria is necessary for the economic growth of the country. And due to this, there is a power dynamic present. Obviously, with Shell holding dominance over Nigeria. Shell, with this power, can ultimately control and influence the decision-making process and the narrative. Now that we have discussed the relationship between the Nigerian government and the Shell Corporation, it is important to examine the opinions formulated after the crises. The Nigerian government and people have claimed that the number of spills by third-party interference was exaggerated by Shell, so Shell did not have to provide compensation to the people. They also report that compensation for areas of Western or developed countries in which oil spills occur receive greater compensation and have a quicker cleanup. As well, they claimed environmental racism. Now, environmental racism is defined as poorer areas or areas where the population is of color are subject to more pollution by big companies. It is important to note that companies develop in these areas if a crisis occurs, such as an oil spill or pollution occurs, there is less of an outcry and demand for proper treatment by other nations. This can be examined through other oil spills that have occurred in different areas and the one that occurred in the Niger Delta. Now let's examine the side of the Shell Corporation. Shell, as mentioned, claimed 80% of the spills were due to third-party interference. And although there is some truth to these claims, the Amnesty International reported that 89 of the spills may have been wrongly labeled as theft or sabotage. Now, in Shell's defense, there is a history of vandalism, theft, and sabotage at the site of oil pipelines in developing countries. It is also important to mention that Shell claims they act in an appropriate and timely manner regardless of spill cause and where the spill occurred. But in one instance, Shell took 252 days to visit one oil spill, even though it was just outside of the oil company. And it is required under Nigerian law that oil companies visit and conduct a formal report within 24 hours of the reported spill. Multiple reports and opinions have claimed that the Nigerian government should have stepped in for its people and protection of its land. Many claim they should have enforced laws, taken action against Shell to protect their own. So now that we have discussed the history, the relationship, and the sides of this story, now we can get into the intercultural barriers that created a strain in communication. It is clear the Nigerian people, their land and environment were neglected by Shell and the Nigerian government. And it is true that if the discourse between the two was clear, open, and fair, one could say the Nigerian people could have been treated and compensated appropriately for the spills in the Niger Delta. However, the communication barriers resulted in prolonged cleanup, poor compensation, and a strain on all the relationships of all the parties. So let's get into these barriers. The first I want to discuss is Western ethocentrism. It's the idea that Western culture, value, practices, institutions are of greater value than others. I think Benjamin Franklin really embodied this idea in a few words when he said, "Savages we call them, because their manners differ from ours," when discussing his view on American Indians. It is key to recognize that Shell possibly delayed urgency of cleanups due to the concept that the Nigerian people, or savages they may refer to them, and their land was less, and relied on their views other than practicing in a way in which allowed for communication between the two sides. Next, I would like to discuss prejudice and stereotyping. Shell, as mentioned before, overreported the number of spills caused by vandalism. The Shell company used a preconceived opinion that was not based on reason or fact. They assumed, since in most developing countries this occurs, that this was the reason for the majority of the spills, even when there was a lack of factual evidence. This completely shut off a dialogue between the two parties to come to a conclusion of the spills. Next, we will discuss racism. Now, this isn't the racism that you may generally think of. In this experience and in this situation, this deals with environmental racism. The Nigerian people felt the attention to the crises was not given the appropriate attention by Shell or surrounding nations, due to the fact that Nigeria is primarily a country composed of people of color and as well a developing country. It appears throughout all of these instances, Shell is operating under a bias and preference for Western culture, which results in lesser compensation for developing countries and the ability to exploit their land, people, and resources for their own gain. Assumed similarities is what I wish to talk about next. Now, one could say, and many have commented, that the Nigerian government should have stepped in, enforced laws, rules, and regulations to protect the people and their land against the multiple spills that occurred by the Shell oil pipelines. And many countries took an assumed similarity that Nigerian government would step in, even though they did not. But it is important to mention that it has been stated that when fast pace of globalization occurs in developing countries, accountability gaps are created. We should also mention that we talked about the power dynamic. Nigerian government relies heavily on the income and infrastructure of the Shell Oil Company, and maybe did not practice in the best benefits of their people and land due to this fact. There was a dialogue that was prevented between the two parties, resulting not only in the assumed similarities that the Nigerian government would step in and enforce laws, rules, regulations, fines to the Shell Corporation, but also that the Nigerian government realized that if they lost this relationship, they could lose a lot of economic growth. Next, I want to discuss, and lastly, high anxiety. High anxiety is almost exactly as it sounds. So when these two countries have different views, ways of life, living, cultures, language, an anxiety creates between both parties. And as this anxiety increases, dialogue and communication decrease. There was high anxiety for each party, and thus communication decreased greatly among both. Now, how can these communications be overcome? Well, I will bring up a series of solutions to these communication barriers. So we now know that it is clear that miscommunication resulting from cultural differences had a detrimental effect on all parties involved. And in order to continue oil shell production in Nigeria, the cultural differences must be acknowledged to ensure proper communication during current and future correspondence. The analysis below will facilitate relationships between both parties, propose solutions to ensure a new conflict does not exist in the future. There is an economic interest and importance to maintain relationship between Shell and the Nigerian government. Shell maintains and produces a revenue from maintaining their presence in Nigeria, and Nigeria receives a large source of its revenue from the oil company. Now, I would like to bring up recognizing the difference and accepting the culture. The first key in this solution and the most immediate effect is for each party to realize that they operate in different ways. That is the first and most key step. And the next is not only to recognize these differences, but to accept them. To say, hey, we are different, and we accept these differences, but we must also realize that we do differ, and we must take steps to approach this communication barrier. I would also like to bring up Erin Meyer's cultural mapping. Her mapping gives key insight into how communication of agreements, negotiations, disagreements, and context falls within each country. By purchasing her cultural map, the two companies will be able to map their countries in comparison and to understand where they differ extremely and where they come together. This will create a long-term successful plan. And by first acknowledging and accepting these differences will be the first step in realizing that communication barriers occurred due to the cultural differences of both parties. I would like to thank you all for this time, and may we remember that there is an importance of understanding that although we differ, these differences can be noted and successfully examined to create a healthy, positive, and effective relationship between differing cultures.